Chapter 35. Captain Daniel Morris sat in the chair with his face in his hands and his elbows on his knees. The chair was in a small room which had only a table and 4 chairs. The room was used by the Judge Advocate General, or JAG as it is more commonly known by among the troops, to question personnel and investigate any situation resulting in the loss of life, which might be due to criminal negligence. JAG representatives had been gracious enough to thank Captain Morris upon his arrival, and had been somewhat consoling in their comments about the incident they were investigating. Still, Morris knew why he was here. No matter how gracious they were, if they didn't like what he said, they had the authority to slap the cuffs on him and haul his butt off to the brig. Sitting in the small windowless room with a customary one-way glass on one wall, he thought about the events leading him here. He kept arriving at the same conclusion. He had absolutely no idea what went wrong, or why it went wrong. When things went south, there was the pandemonium expected in such situations, but then his training took over, and he did his best to document and record everything while it was still fresh. Those notes were now in a closed manila envelope sitting in front of him on the table. Several times he opened the envelope so he could read, reread, and then read again to look for anything he might have missed. There wasn't. The whole thing had relegated himself to his dreams, or, more accurately, his nightmares. After waiting for about 10 minutes in the Holloman Air Force Base interrogation room, the door opened and 3 smartly dressed uniformed investigators entered with notes in hand. Seeing that superior officers were entering the room, Captain Morris immediately stood and saluted. Behind the colonel and 2 lieutenants who had entered, an Air Force stenographer followed them, taking her position in the corner of the room out of sight of Captain Morris. The senior officer among them was the first to speak. "At ease," said the colonel. "Please have a seat, Captain Morris. We have a lot to go over in this inquiry." Captain Morris relaxed his stance and took a seat. As he did, he looked at the 2 men and 1 woman sitting across the table from him. They were arranging their materials, not only their notepads, but also more than 1 recording device. Eventually, they got their affairs in order, and the colonel began to speak. "Captain, my name is Colonel Mike Dvorak. On my left is Lieutenant Lindsay Almanar, and to my right is Lieutenant Giovanni Jones. While I am the senior officer in charge of the investigation, these 2 lieutenants are my co-investigators. I have given them complete authority to ask any questions, and I expect you to answer their questions as clearly and completely as if I was the one asking the question. Understood?" "Yes, sir," answered Daniel. "Good," replied the colonel. As the colonel looked down at his notes to get his thoughts together, Captain Morris decided now would be a good time to get his own notes out and arranged. Daniel noticed the clackety-clack coming from the stenographer had stopped. For a split second he wondered why he hadn't noticed its sound before now. Probably simply because he was so nervous about this meeting, and how these 3 people had the power to decide his fate, let alone his career. What he didn't know was the 3 had already come to a unanimous conclusion about the loss of life that terrible morning in the eastern Atlantic Ocean. They had gathered enough evidence to know exactly what caused the loss of friendlies that day, but the colonel had directed his team to not let the captain know this, just in case he might offer up some details that A, they didn't know already, and B, would incriminate him in the events of that day. They wanted to keep their cards close to their chest. After getting his materials in order, the colonel began. "Captain, as you know, the events of 17 June of this year resulted in the loss of life of several friendlies on board the USS Ptolemy. You were at the weapons control console in charge of the guided missile that struck the ship. We have asked you here today to explain not only your role in the events of that day, but also what occurred immediately preceding the disaster, as well as after. For documentation purposes, today's proceedings will follow the procedures outlined in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," responded Captain Morris. To lead the discussion today, Lieutenant Almanar has a few questions.
Thank you, sir,
said the lieutenant.
Captain, I'd like you to state for the record your name, rank, service number, where you were stationed, and what your job was.
The word wasn't lost on Captain Morris. He wondered if this is how it was going to end for him. No matter. Now wasn't the time for such thoughts. I am Captain Daniel Morris, service number DZ-18883-929. At the time of the incident, I was stationed here at Holloman Air Force Base. I am a Predator laser technician, and it is my responsibility to respond to the commands of my superior officers in the arming of weapons and to direct the laser onto the target.
And when the incident happened, you were on duty?
Asked Lieutenant Almanar. Yes, replied Daniel.
Please tell us what happened that day from your perspective,
requested the lieutenant. Captain Morris looked down at his notes and spent 5 seconds refreshing his mind. He then straightened his back and began speaking. On the day in question, I was at my post in the Mobile Command and Control bunker that oversaw the Predator UAV CS-454 flying patrol over the Atlantic Fleet during the NATO exercises which were in full swing. The mission parameters handed to me by my superior officers were for my team to fly eye-in-the-sky patrols during the exercises of 17 June and relay our observations to the commanders on board the USS Carl Vinson. This was part of a cooperative set of exercises involving both the Navy and the Air Force. Per my orders, I was to maintain an open channel of communication with Navy Colonel Martin Swain on board the carrier, who would take that information and direct the forces on the surface.
Before you continue, Captain, do you remember speaking with him that day?
Asked the lieutenant. Yes, I do, replied the captain. I remember there were several operations we successfully completed, and I remember him expressing his approval on the performance of my team.
Thank you. Proceed.
On the day in question, my team was directed to change our overall flight pattern to come in closer to the shore, on the southern end of the English Channel. We were one of the few Predators equipped with live-fire weapons, since some of the exercises included selecting dummy targets and taking them out. We weren't told ahead of time what the targets were going to be. Based on previous experiences we had been part of, we assumed the targets would be land-based, typically old equipment that had been retired, such as decommissioned tanks and personnel transports parked in the middle of a field. Did you receive orders to deploy your weapons on a target? Asked Colonel Dvorak. Yes, sir, replied Captain Morris. And to the best of your recollection, what did those orders say? Asked the colonel. I wrote in my notes that it was order number ANE-2892. The orders said to set our targets on a derelict ship that had been towed out to coordinates 49 degrees, 33 minutes, 56.22 seconds north, by 4 degrees, 6 minutes, 42.09 seconds west. The pilot plotted his course and took the necessary steps to relocate our UAV to the requested location.
When you got there, what did you find?
Asked Lieutenant Almanar. When we arrived at the coordinates, we found 2 ships, the derelict ship as expected, but also another ship about 30 clicks to the west. My CO made an inquiry and determined the other ship had some brass on it who were observing the exercises.
Then what happened?
We arrived at the requested coordinates and went into a high-altitude holding pattern. I kept my sights trained on the target ship all the time. As I was doing that, I was also going through the checklist to determine the best firing solution to the ship, since I knew it was only a matter of time before we would receive orders to fire. After receiving the clearance to fire, I trained my targeting laser on the ship, and, after the countdown, the weapon was released. But the weapon didn't make it to its intended target, did it? This was the first time Lieutenant Jones had spoken since entering the room. His voice was lower in timbre, and he spoke with a certain taint. Later, Captain Morris wondered if this uniqueness to his voice had anything to do with his name being Giovanni, or just a coloration from where he grew up. Turning to Lieutenant Jones, Captain Morris answered, "No, it didn't." After about 10 seconds, it became apparent the weapon wasn't tracking in the manner we had intended. I was able to verify the targeting laser was definitely lighting up the derelict ship, but, according to the weapons specialist in charge of the weapon, it began veering off course. "What happened then?" asked the colonel. "When we saw that not only was it veering off course, but was on a direct collision course with the other ship, the commander gave the order for self-destruct. The problem was, no matter what we did, we could never get a return ping from the weapon indicating the self-destruct command had been received. We continued to receive a video feed from the nose camera of the Hellfire missile as it tracked directly to the other ship. There was nothing we could do to keep the weapon from zeroing in on the friendly ship."
What steps were taken at that point? Did you or your team try to warn the ship?
asked Lieutenant Almanar. "Our commander got on the horn to the commander of that ship to tell him what was happening, but even as he was doing it, everybody in the room knew it was going to be too little, too late. The weapon was only 15 seconds from impact, so there was no time to get word to the crew to brace for impact." At this point, Captain Morris was beginning to get a little emotional. Ever since that day, those 15 seconds constantly replayed themselves over and over in his brain. He hadn't slept much, and it was really starting to wear on him. It had been a week since the incident, and he had been relieved of duty until the investigation was completed. Although the room was quite comfortable, even a little on the cool side, Captain Morris was sweating profusely from the strain of being under the microscope like this. "What's the next thing you remember?" The colonel's voice seemed to take on a conciliatory timbre to it, which struck the captain as strange. Even so, he continued with the story. "Well, at that point, we were helpless to do anything but watch as the distance meter counted down until the weapon hit the ship." The captain's eyes now drifted to nothing in particular, as if staring at something a million miles away. "All I could remember is the screen of static. In the bottom right-hand corner there was a single word. It just said, 'offline,' in red letters. I remember staring at that word, praying we had misread the readouts, that it hadn't really hit the ship with friendlies on it." The captain's head began to slightly shake back and forth. But there was no mistaking it. Letting out a repressed exhale, Captain Morris rested both elbows on the table, then rested his forehead in his palms with his eyes closed. "There wasn't anything we could do. All I could think about, all I still think about, is a weapon I deployed killed some of our guys." For a few moments there was silence in the room. The words of Captain Morris sunk in. The only sound was the whir of the idle transcription machine in the corner behind the captain, as well as the almost silent whoosh of the air-conditioning duct. The two lieutenants took notes while the colonel studied the man before him. As he considered the body of evidence they had already uncovered, and this interrogation certainly hadn't uncovered anything they didn't already know, Colonel Dvorak decided now was the time to reveal to Captain Morris the true nature of what happened that day. He knew a situation like this could mess up a good soldier for the rest of his life, and with the excellent record this one had, he certainly didn't want to see him get screwed up. Looking at the transcriber in the corner, Colonel Dvorak said with a smile on his face, "Nancy, I think we're done here. Thank you." With quick precision, the transcriptionist folded up her machine and made her way out of the room. This was also a prearranged signal to the lieutenants that their services would no longer be needed. They gathered up their materials and exited the room right after Nancy, closing the door behind them. For his part, Captain Morris didn't know what to make of this new course of events. Since he was used to being somewhat fatalistic in estimating what was going to happen to him, he figured now was when the colonel was going to slap him in cuffs and send him up the river, a fate that couldn't have been farther from the truth. Looking the captain in the eyes, Colonel Dvorak got up from his chair, circumnavigating around the table until he took Nancy's chair, and sat backward on it to the right of Captain Morris. "Son," the colonel began, "what I'm about to reveal to you is for your ears only. You are not to repeat this information to anyone who doesn't know it already. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," snapped back the captain. This was certainly not what he was expecting. "Good. We began investigating this incident as soon as it happened, and, early on, we learned your team had done a perfect job in executing its orders. You need to know not only were the events of that day not your fault, but they happened because we were under a direct hacking attack by a small band of terrorists who call themselves Al-Jarab. They are not the kind of terrorists who kill with suicide bombers. They are the kind who kill with their computer expertise. I know you've been out of the loop since that day. All predators have been grounded, so we can retrofit every one of them with new encryption technology that will keep this from happening again." The captain stared at the colonel with a bewildered look on his face. "You mean the Predator was hacked?" The colonel finished his sentence. "Yes. The terrorists not only hacked into the avionics of the Predator, but were also able to hack into the weapons guidance systems. They were the ones who directed the missile to the friendly ship, not you." Captain Morris, who had been sitting on the edge of the chair listening to the colonel, now flopped back in his seat and expelled a rush of air which seemingly had been balled up in his chest since the incident a week ago. He tipped his head back and just stared at the acoustic ceiling for a while. "So, this really isn't our fault?" It was more a statement than a question. "No," confirmed the colonel. "It was a band of terrorists I have sworn to get if it's the last thing I do. I lost a good friend on that ship, and I will not sleep well until I know the murderers are dead." Tilting his head forward again and looking the colonel in the eyes, the captain now asked his own question. "If I may, sir, who did you lose?" Looking down at the floor, the colonel took in a breath and said, "He was a good friend, normally stationed at the Pentagon, who wanted to be present at the NATO exercises this time. He brought his personal assistant with him, and she also was killed. Army Vice Chief of Staff Stephen Salkin and his personal assistant, Mrs. Judith Brinstock." "Brinstock?" asked the captain with his eyebrows squeezed together. "Yes," confirmed the colonel. "She was Admiral Brinstock's wife." Admiral Brinstock had just received the news of Judith's death and was sitting in his chair slumped over his desk. His head was dipped and perpendicular to the desk. His extended arms lay in front of him, and the memorandum lazily fell from his right hand. There was no sound in his office except for the silent, piercing shrill of Kenji's heart falling to pieces. As he sat there, he did what most would do, asking himself how things would have been different if he had done this or that. He felt that if they had not recently filed for divorce, had he been the man she deserved, she might still be alive today because she wouldn't have gone back to work. He got up from his desk on unsteady legs and retreated to the window behind his desk. He looked, but there wasn't much to see outside his Pentagon office. The window was only there to let in some ambient sunlight. It didn't matter. He wasn't really looking at anything. No amount of light would change the growing darkness now starting to form in his heart. With each passing second, the sterling reputation this man had spent decades fine-tuning, his dedication to the pursuit of all his commander-in-chief directed, his drive to be the perfect soldier, all congealed into a new man. This man may have looked the same on the outside, but on the inside now had a new mission. The death of the woman he still loved was the catalyst which turned him into a man willing to kill anything or anyone who got in his way of avenging her death. The person deciding what that course of action would be wasn't only going to be the President of the United States. No, now he was going to see to it that the morons who took the life of his ex-wife, no, his wife would pay. And if anyone got in the way of his plans, they would become collateral damage. She may have died at the hands of a missile which made a hellacious sound as it detonated, but the death of Admiral Brinstock's conscience made no sound. From that day on, he knew he would kill anybody who got in his way. Speaking to her spirit, which he wanted to believe was in the room, he said, "I will avenge your death if it is the last thing I do, Judith. I don't care if I have to personally kill every last terrorist on this planet. I will not rest until your killers, all their families, and all their friends are dead. To any who ask, I will always say I'm doing it for the good of the country, but—" He paused. "All that I am about to do will be done for you. I don't care what I have to do. I will avenge your death."
Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.